welcome to What's the Chari-tea, the podcast for all non-profit people. Today we are spilling the tea on what it's really like in the third sector. My name is Louise Dawtry and we've got a fantastic guest with us today, Dr. Claire Ashley. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so pleased to have you here. Really wanted to get your medical perspective on the challenges that we face in the non-profit sector. Obviously, a lot of that is around burnout. So it's fantastic to get you here with me so we can really unpick what burnout is and how we can prevent it, most importantly. So would you like to just introduce yourself to the listeners?
Thank you so much, Louise. It's an absolute pleasure to be here on this podcast today. So I am a doctor by background. So I qualified as a doctor. I'll give you a very brief potted history back in 2008. And then I went through the training process and eventually qualified as a GP at the end of 2018. And then, unfortunately for me, in my very first full-time salaried role as a GP, I ended up burning out within 6 months. And for me, this seemingly came out of the blue because I'd sailed through medical school and every stage of a very competitive career without any mental health problems, without having any sort of symptoms or what have you. And so I genuinely thought I was really good at managing my stress. And now, unfortunately for me, I went from feeling really well and never having experienced a mental health problem to, within that 6-month period, virtually ticking every box of a mental health crisis by the end of that 6-month period. And I really didn't recognise who I was or what I had become by that point. And it was an incredibly lonely, isolating, shameful experience, actually. And I then ended up going on quite a long recovery process during which I was supported by NHS practitioner health to get better. So I had a GP and a therapist look after me. And whilst I was going on this recovery journey, I really started to think, I can't be the only person that's experienced this. You know, there was a lot of, as I said, guilt and shame and I really just didn't understand what had happened to me. And just to give a little bit more context as well, so I also have a degree in neuroscience and a postgraduate qualification in public health. So I have a lot of insight into the clinical side of neuroscience and psychiatry and all of that sort of stuff. But I had no training on how to recognise the signs of stress overload in myself. And so I was completely clueless about how I ended up in that position. And I kind of was like, well, if a doctor with all of this knowledge and experience didn't know what was happening to them, then there's this knowledge gap. How can anyone else understand what burnout really is and how you end up in it, and then also how you get better? So at that point, we were in the middle of the pandemic. Remember that? Yeah. Yes. And so we were really, we were very isolated physically, and the support networks that I would normally have turned to just weren't there because physically we weren't allowed to meet up. And so I went online and I started sharing my journey online, and I had such an overwhelming response from people in similar situations, not just doctors, but other healthcare professionals. And then a lot of people in the public sector as well, reaching out to me and saying that they were also struggling. And I thought, okay, I'm not the only one. And so I kind of grew this community, and out of that developed a completely new career strand in burnout and stress management. So I ended up doing a lot of research into burnout, making it kind of very much my specialism. I wrote a book called The Burnout Doctor, and now a lot of my work is advocacy and education about burnout, evidence-based burnout prevention and recovery. So that's a brief, as brief as I can make it, because I can talk about burnout a lot, as you will learn as we go through this. Brief kind of summary of my journey to here.
Brilliant. So part of the reason why I set up What's the Chari-tea community online and also the podcast is because, very similarly to yourselves and in your medical profession, but in the non-profit sector we see a huge issue with burnout as well. There's a lot of data out there around how many people are experiencing burnout in the charity sector, and unfortunately a lot of people then tend to go on and just leave the sector altogether. So I'm not okay with that, and I want to try and advocate for us charity professionals and anyone that works in a non-profit to try and address the real issues that we're facing in the sector, how burnout comes about, talking about it to try and break it down and break that stigma down. And obviously you said there that you felt quite shamed about going through that, and we shouldn't. So I want to really hold space for people to talk about the really great stuff in the sector and sort of champion why more people should get involved in charity work and volunteering, but also to try and help protect our well-being a little bit more and reduce those numbers of us that are experiencing it. So I was really keen to pick your brains today, if that's okay. The word burnout, we hear it a lot, and I think there's a lot of noise around burnout. So you've obviously seen it in clinical settings and you've been through it yourself. So how would you define it in a way that kind of cuts through all of the noise?
Yeah, so let's start with the official definition of burnout, because I think there are limitations to it, but I think it's a really great place to start. So the World Health Organization has given it an official definition, but actually it didn't give it until 2019, which is quite interesting. Right. I think burnout obviously has existed much longer than that.
So but it's relatively new concept.
Yeah,
then.
Absolutely, particularly in terms of its definition. So it was first documented in the medical literature back in the 70s by a psychologist who was working in a free HIV and AIDS clinic in New York. And what they realised was that the healthcare workers in that particular setting, which you can imagine was very stressful, being in that location, being a free clinic in the US, but also at the dawn of the AIDS epidemic, when no one really understood what was happening, very distressing, lots of young men dying, and no one really knew what was happening. And so these healthcare workers were developing stress-related illnesses that hadn't been previously defined. And so that was the first bit of work that was done on burnout and when the phrase was coined. But yeah, it wasn't until 2019 that it was officially recognised, which ironically was the year of my own burnout.
Right, yeah.
And so the official definition is that burnout is an occupational phenomenon that arises as a result of unsuccessfully managed stress at work. And there are three components to it. The first one is depersonalization, which is a bit of a difficult word to understand, I think, but it basically means the development of cynicism, apathy and detachment from your work. The second component is emotional exhaustion. So that's the fatigue of caring for too much for too long, feeling absolutely tapped out by the emotional side of your work. And I think that the majority of people that end up burnt out, what we see from the literature is that that's the component that most people start with. But not everyone that experiences emotional exhaustion, I think we can all identify with that at some point through our working lives, goes on to develop burnout. And the third component is reduced performance at work in whatever form that takes for yourself. So without those three things, without being in a job and without prolonged stress, technically you don't have burnout. Now, I personally think that there are some limitations to that definition. So the first one is that I think that burnout happens outside of the workplace, particularly thinking about parents and caregivers.
Yeah.
It also excludes groups of people that are at higher risk, particularly people that are neurodivergent. So autism and people with ADHD go through rapid cycles of burnout where work might be a factor, but it's not the thing that is fueling that burnout. It's their neurodivergence, being in a neurotypical world, and it's multifactorial. And then the other limitations, I guess, with the definition is it's like I said, it's very much defined as a workplace problem. It's not defined as a medical problem, although it looks and feels very much like a medical and a mental health problem to experience. And so I think for some people it feels really difficult to understand why is it given this label as a workplace problem. And the reason is that the World Health Organization is very clear that they want the responsibility for culture change to be with organizations and employers, not with the individuals, because it's not the fault of the individual that burns out. It is the fault of, if you want to call it the fault of the employer. It's their responsibility, I would say, rather than fault, actually. Yeah. And so they are very, very clear about that. And that's why that definition is what it is. And the other thing to think about burnout, they're saying it's a normal endpoint, basically, of prolonged stress. When you experience stress, your body releases stress hormones, and from an evolutionary perspective, it's meant to give us a survival edge, right? You know, you're in your cave as a caveman.
Yeah.
And you're going out hunting, you see a bear or a lion on the horizon and you go into fight or flight, you know, you get flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, you know, your body changes, your heart rate goes faster, you start breathing faster, you feel panicky, you know, your blood is diverted to your muscles and to your eyes widen so you get more light and so you can see more sharply. You're ready to fight the threat or you're ready to run from it. And so that gives you an evolutionary advantage. But in the modern world, you get that same response, you know, regardless of the source of your stress. So you could go into fight or flight by just opening an email or walking into your workplace or having a difficult conversation with a colleague or with a client, for instance, or struggling to meet your deadlines. And so in that situation, your stress response is working against you rather than with you. And if you're in that state for a prolonged period of time, then unfortunately, we know that then leads to burnout. So the World Health Organization believes that burnout is a normal thing to experience if you're under that amount of stress for that amount of time. And so you remove yourself from the source of the stress and you start to get better. So that's why it's not kind of considered a mental health or a medical problem in that sense.
Yeah.
But again, you know, you asked for cutting through the noise, and you're right, burnout is a term that gets flung around a lot, I think, without necessarily understanding that there is an official definition, that you need all of those components to really tick the boxes for a diagnosis of it. And I think the easiest way to understand it is if you are experiencing a lot of the signs and symptoms of stress overload, and you're not able to get over it with some time, you know, a short time away from work, you know, a nice weekend, a nice trip or what have you, and it's really starting to impact on other areas of your life, then that's the point at which you need to think, actually, have I crossed over from normal stress or helpful stress into stress where it's negatively affecting you and your health?
Yes, that's a really important part, I think, for what I wanted to discuss, because it's important to see that difference between the normal kind of stress and stress that is helpful, because we all experience stress to some degree just day to day in our day-to-day lives, don't we? But it's at what point does that tip and then it's not a healthy kind of stress, it's actually a very unhealthy. Can we just unpack that a little bit? How can people listening kind of tune into what's the good stress and what's the bad stress, if you like? Yeah,
so you raise a really important point there. And one of the kickers about that slide into burnout is that denial is one of the features. And that's part of the process. And so certainly when I look back at my own experience in that 6-month period where I went from, you know, feeling really good and functioning well at work and performing well, to ending up in a mental health crisis, you know, ticking all the boxes of, you know, intrusive thoughts and insomnia and panic and low motivation, low mood and self-neglect, but still turning up to work at this point. You know, there was a process that I went through, but I just didn't see it at the time. And that's partly because I didn't have the knowledge or training to be able to recognize it, which is completely ironic given my background, but it's not something that I got taught at medical school or in my postgraduate training.
Which is interesting.
Yes, it is changing. Yeah, it is changing now. But
Yeah.
I started medical school in 2002, so it was a very traditional medical education curriculum that we had. And so that, you know, self-care for doctors wasn't really taught, but I have had now, luckily, the privilege to be able to teach medical students at the medical school that I went to, and that curriculum is very much changing, and there's now much more of an awareness that the job is hard, it's stressful, you've got to look after yourself, you've got to look after your colleagues, and about time too. You know, unfortunately it's too late for me, but for the new doctors that are coming through. And
that's great that you can be a part of that and shape those conversations as well.
Absolutely. It's such it's a privilege to be able to use my experience in the way that I have to help others. But looking back, I can see that there was this decline. I just, as I said, I didn't have the knowledge. So many people don't have that knowledge. I wasn't in the habit of regularly monitoring my stress levels or checking in with myself. And then by the time I realized that I was in over my head, you know, I started to have panic attacks, and I'd never had panic attacks before. That was the moment when I really thought, okay, I'm in over my head and I need help to get over this. Like, this is now controlling me rather than the other way around. But looking back, there were warning signs. And it was only when I started to upskill myself and read around the subject that I realised that there is a documented slide and process into burnout that the majority of people are not aware of. And it's called the 5 stages of burnout. And at every stage, there are different signs and symptoms. And so I think it's really important that people have an awareness and a knowledge of these 5 stages, and take the time to reflect on where they're at, so that they can recognise themselves before they get into burnout. And the reason why it's important to know this is because if you end up in burnout, talking about how it's different from stress, then you need on average 3.5 months of work sick. It's a 1 to 3 year recovery period. That is very different from regular stress, which everyone experiences. And it also comes with a whole raft of health complications as well. So, you're more likely to be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, have a heart attack, be involved in a serious accident. If you're under the age of 45, then your chances of dying from any cause goes up significantly. And so this isn't just regular stress, and so it's really important that you recognise yourself before you end up in that point. So the 5 stages of burnout, I'll just talk briefly through what they are now. So the first phase of burnout is the honeymoon phase, which is pretty self-explanatory, generally associated with starting a new job or taking on new initiatives or tasks or a new role at work. But basically, you're really enthusiastic about your work, like you're filled with optimism and creativity. You're really productive, you say yes to everything, and you're like, you're really feeling it. You're in that honeymoon, blissful stage, and you're loving it. And it sounds great and it feels great. The danger with the honeymoon phase is that if you end up taking on too much, and you start saying yes to everything without really kind of prioritizing your own need for rest and relaxation and what have you, then you can progress to the next stage, which is the onset of stress stage. And this is a stage where you start to notice that some days are starting to feel a little bit more stressful than others. And it's characterized by feeling like your job is the most important thing in the world. So you start to withdraw socially from your friends and your family. You start to spend more time at work, and you start to overwork, basically, because you're trying to meet the demands of all of your tasks. A lot of it is that behavior is kind of pushed by the stress that you're under and the symptoms that you're starting to get. And in this phase, people, maybe, psychologically, you might start to notice some executive dysfunction, so difficulty with memory, concentration, focus, attention, but they're mild at this stage, and maybe the start of some physical symptoms. So for burnout, it's a very, very physical experience. The most commonly experienced physical symptom is muscular aches and pains, which I think a lot of us get anyway. But also, headaches, stomach pains, chest pains, palpitations, lots and lots of physical symptoms, also sleep disturbance, or sometimes that can be a primary symptom, sometimes it can be a product of the worry that you're experiencing. Then if you notice that the majority of your days are becoming more stressful, then you're into the chronic stress phase. And this is where, your performance starts to drop off, your productivity decreases, you start to feel overwhelmed, you might be procrastinating. All of the physical symptoms start to become much more significant compared to the onset of stress stage. You might be feeling in this stage very guilty about what is happening to you. And actually, the experience of guilt is so pervasive in burnout that some researchers argue that it should form part of the definition. And that guilt leads you to blame yourself. And so you force yourself to work harder, but without that realization that you're just perpetuating the burnout cycle in that process. In this particular stage of burnout as well, a lot of people develop emotional dysregulation, which is one of the hallmark features of burnout. So that is when you can't control your emotional responses to stress. So small things like, having a difficult conversation, or maybe someone just makes a comment, or someone asks you to do something extra at the end of the day, and normally you'd take it in your stride. You'd be like, yeah, that's no problem. Or you'd feel calm, collected. You might find yourself bursting into tears, or getting really angry, or, flying off the handle, not being able to control your emotions in the same way. And again, that's not your fault. It's because of the changes that are happening to your body and your brain as a result of the stress that you're under. But that is one of the hallmark features, and it's typically in that stage that you start to develop it. Now, at this stage, you're not in burnout yet, so you still have an opportunity. But I mentioned denial. You're mad in denial at that stage.
Okay.
So the chances are that you haven't really consciously recognised what's happening to you. And this is one of the things about burnout is unless you have that knowledge and unless you are consciously monitoring yourself, you could be really symptomatic, really, really struggling, and yet not have that awareness of what's happening to you. But people around you will know, because you're really going to be struggling at this point. Your behaviour will have changed. You friends, family, colleagues, they 100% will have noticed what's happening to you. The danger is that because you're so into the stress at this point, that if people say something to you, the chances are you'll go to that place of denial and you might get angry or upset. But if people are raising concerns in this stage and you have that awareness now, hopefully listening to this podcast or reading the book, then that's a moment for you to kind of go, okay, actually maybe I should look at this and make some changes. But it's hard to do it when you're in it, really hard.
It's a real heady mix of the denial and the guilt, and obviously the physical symptoms is, you're not going to feel great and able to make better decisions. No. It's just everything.
It's the perfect storm.
Yeah. So I guess that when you break it down like that, you can see why it happens. One of my other guests from the last series, Rob Huggins, he is a charity CEO, and he went through burnout, and he very openly talked about that on the podcast. And he said it crept in. That's the word, and I hear that word, this creeping. Yeah, it creeps in before you can really identify it often. And I think the way you've just talked about it there, it's just, you can see why. But I'm really glad that you said about being aware and that self-reflection, taking the time to reflect and learn about yourself. I'm such a huge advocate, and I bang on about this all the time with people, but we don't often stop to just take a minute to process what we are doing, either in our personal life and at work, because it's just on to the next. And without spending that time to know yourself, how can you identify when things are starting to go a bit wobbly? And
it's really difficult because I think, it's not just work culture, but it's just society as a whole. Society values productivity and always being on the go, hustle culture, and also the economic climate right now, cost of living crisis. We're asked to do more with less at work. I think particularly in the charitable sector, it's difficult to raise money at the minute. And the funds that you're raising isn't, it's not going as far as it used to. So you're being asked to do more with less, and that's really tough. And so and I think especially in the charitable sector, where quite often people are doing it because they're really passionate about the cause as well, and they really care. It's really hard to think about yourself and to put yourself first. But the old saying of put your oxygen mask on before attending to anyone else is really true, and especially in burnout. Nothing bad is going to happen if you take a little bit of time to look after yourself. And I think in burnout, taking some time to reflect on where you're at with your stress. What does that actually mean? Like, how can you actually do this? And especially when you're really busy and you're not in the habit of looking after yourself, particularly in the charitable sector when you're looking after other people, and especially, dare I say it, if you're a woman and you're used to caring for other people as well, because we don't put ourselves first, especially if you're a parent. How do you find the time, and how do you do that? So are you all right if I give a few practical tips now? Yeah.
Yes, please.
So the first thing is, how do you get into that habit of monitoring your stress levels? So having an awareness and knowledge about the symptoms that I've just described and what burnout actually is really helps. And then you can go and look at those symptoms and think, where am I at right now? So you could do a bit of journaling. There are burnout scales that you can use. So in the book, I've got a burnout quiz, which is widely available. It's called the Burnout Assessment Tool. It's a bit dry because it is a scientific tool, but it's fairly easy to use, and it gives you a score, which is then red, amber, or green. So it's color coded. It's quite easy to use. I know some people are very tech-minded, tech-savvy. A lot of people have smartphones and smartwatches. So there are apps or various watches that tell you how stressed you are these days. Tory is a really helpful stress monitoring app, and there is a paid version and a free version. Whoop and I think Garmin, Fitbit, they tell you how stressed you are as well. They measure heart rate variability, which again is scientifically validated. It's all about finding what works for you in your lifestyle, and you don't need to spend more than, dare I say it, 10 minutes a week doing this, really.
Yeah.
That's all you need to do. You do have to prioritize it though. So pick a method that works for you and you can get on with. You know, for some people, like my husband, for instance, journaling is not for him, but he will look at a smartwatch.
Right, yeah.
So for him, that would be the right thing
Yes.
to do. For me, I'm quite a little bit more introspective, and I love to journal. So that would be my method of choice.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's knowing what's going to fit with your lifestyle, what your preferred method is, but then also knowing, okay, what am I going to do if I realise that I'm becoming more stressed? And that's possibly the slightly more tricky thing to get right. But the first step definitely is to monitor.
Yeah. And I think that's something through my work, supporting organisations with their people and culture strategies and their wellbeing initiatives and management training and things. It's having that sort of plan and to get that reflection and awareness with your team, but also that point where I sometimes do a 1 out of 10 rate, you know, in one-to-ones, for example. Tell me what your well-being, how do you feel out of 10? And if you're 10, that's brilliant. If you're 0, that's awful. And we never want to be there. But if you tell me you're maybe a 6 or a 5, what can we do? If you ever get to that point, you're telling me you're a 5 or a 6, what's the plan there? What's in your toolkit to get you back up to the 7, 8, 9,
10? Yeah.
So that sort of leads me on to my next question. What advice would you give to leadership teams or HR professionals working in the sector like myself, as that, you know, that duty of care that employers do have? How do we kind of strike the right balance, I suppose, to help people?
Yeah, this is a really, really tricky thing to get right, actually. Really, really challenging. I mean, I think the first thing to say is, you know, if you've got someone who is experiencing crisis symptoms, and I'm particularly thinking about, you know, thoughts of, you know, at one extreme it's thoughts of self-harm, thoughts of suicide, but then you've also got, you know, your depressive symptoms and, you know, lack of motivation, you know, self-neglect, feeling really down all the time, and any thoughts of severe anxiety, you know, lots of panic and worry and all of that sort of stuff. You know, if someone is really struggling, I'd say, you know, as an HR professional or a wellbeing professional within an organisation, it's not your responsibility to take care of them if they're in that, you know, if their symptoms are very severe, if they're in crisis, in which case it's about signposting them to get medical help or psychological support, therapists, psychologists, whatever. So I think it's important that, you know, HR leaders and what have you, you're still people as well, and it's really important that you don't take on stuff that actually isn't your responsibility or what you're trained to do. But then,
that's another good thing, because I think a lot of HR people, we do. We're just as bad. We take everything on.
You carry a lot.
We want to make people, you know, enjoy their work and be their best at work, but it's
exactly it's so true, and HR professionals are really high risk for burnout for that reason as well. So it's important that you know the people that you need to signpost away. Then the next thing is, particularly when it comes to people that are really stressed, is making changes that are individualized, because burnout is, you know, obviously a lot of it is to do with workplace culture, but for each individual, there will be specific things that are causing them to burn out. And it's about identifying those specific factors for that individual and then giving them targeted support. So when we look at the evidence and the literature around burnout, there are 6 workplace factors that can cause burnout. You only need one to be mismatched in the context of prolonged stress in order to burn out. Quite often people tick more than one box, but again, it's about having that conversation and finding out, okay, what is exactly causing you to feel really stressed at work? So it could be some issues to do with control or autonomy around work, reward, whether or not they're being treated fairly, whether they can feel they can work in alignment with their values and the company's values, supportive community at work, and also workload. So those are the 6 specific work factors that can cause burnout. So I think it's just conversations around, you know, what are the work factors that are affecting that particular individual at that time, and then seeing if you can make small adjustments to help them to manage some of those risk factors. And in burnout, what particularly with prevention, what really matters is going to the root cause of the problem. So we call them problem-based coping. So identifying those causes and then going to the root cause and actually changing them, which can be difficult to do in a resource poor or a very resource tight environment, particularly in your sector where, money can be difficult to come by and your resource has to go that much farther these days. But small changes can make a big difference. And I think sometimes just for the individuals involved, knowing that the changes are being made is sufficient just to help them. And, if you've got someone who's a 5 or a 6 on the wellbeing scale, you're not going to take them to 10. You're looking for those small changes to get them from, say, 5 to a 6 or a 7. It's about being realistic. But there's also a conversation to be had about the individual themselves. Now, burnout is not the fault of any individual, but there will be some groups that are more at risk than others. So you can have a group of employees, they're all stressed, they're all working in the same work environment, but some people will burn out, some people won't. And that's because there are different individual risk factors for burnout. Some people are primed for it compared to others. And again, a lot of these risk factors are not the fault of the individual themselves, but it's helpful to be aware of it so that you can look at, those risk factors and again, support them with changes. So the risk factors are, I've mentioned one already, which is neurodivergence. So people with ADHD and autism go through rapid cycles of burnout. So if you were having a conversation with someone who had autism or ADHD, then you could make some tweaks as to how they work, maybe some reasonable adjustments to help manage some of the pressures that they are uniquely experiencing in the workplace. That will go a long way to managing their burnout risk. So other things that matter are so kind of particularly personality traits. So people who have imposter syndrome, perfectionism, people that are people pleasers tend to be at higher risk of burnout because they take on more and more and more. And they typically are the people where their boundaries around work get obliterated. So maybe some work with them on saying no appropriately is a good thing to do. Mental health problems, previous trauma are also risk factors which you might not be aware of potentially as an employer. But if you're creating a psychologically safe space to work, then you might well be able to get that information out with someone. Childhood events, so trauma in childhood and mixed messages about achievement growing up really prime the brain for burnout as an adult. Again, that might not be something that you're aware of, but this is information that you could share with that individual, and then they could think about that. Stress coping strategies. So if you manage your stress by going to the root cause of the problem and trying to deal with that, then you're protected against burnout. But if you try to manage your emotional responses to it, then you're more at risk. And so again, there's in that situation, someone might benefit from some coaching, or maybe some therapy as well for the other stuff as well, for imposter syndrome, perfectionism, people pleasing. Then coaching and therapy can be really helpful. And also from an HR perspective, I think it's helpful to know the demographics that are more at risk as well. So we mentioned neurodivergent populations. Any marginalised group is at risk because you get the intersectionality of work stress and then whatever unconscious bias or discrimination that individual might be experiencing as well. So LGBTQIA plus, for instance, that's a group that is marginalised and might experience stress in a different way in the same job to someone who isn't part of that community. And then we also know that it's women that are most at risk compared to men. Within that group, it's mothers. And then within that group, again, it's Black, Asian and Latina mothers. This is from a big study that was done in the US, which is why Latina is within that group. I think we have less big Latina population here, but it's ethnic minorities essentially that are more at risk. And so I think knowing that from an HR perspective means that maybe with those groups you can be a little bit more targeted with your questioning and just have that awareness that these are the people that probably need a little bit more support. Yeah.
Interesting.
Lots to think about.
Yeah. There's a lot going on, and all of those things, like we said before, it's just this heady mix of challenges. Some of the things that you've mentioned, I completely relate to it because I, around COVID as well, went through burnout, and those changes in emotions and the denial and the I think you mentioned like cynicism as well. I'm a really positive person generally, but I noticed at that time I was just really quite negative and cynical about work. Whereas before that I had, I loved work. I do love work. So I think it's just, I'm recognising a lot of the stuff that you're talking about in myself. That was so good. Thank you. That's just answered so many important questions, and it's been really good to have that deep dive into what burnout actually is and how to recognise the signs and the stages as well. I didn't realise there was those sort of stages. So I guess if you're listening and you're thinking, oh, those first 2 stages really resonated there, that's kind of that warning sign, because you're saying you're not actually in burnout until you've gone through the 5.
That's right. I think we only got up to stage 3 when I was talking about it. So just very briefly, so that people have got the full picture. The 4th stage of burnout is burnout, which is when you tick all of the features of the definition that I mentioned previously. And then the 5th stage is habitual burnout. So that's when it's pretty self-explanatory. Your burnout is habitualized. You can't get out of it yourself. You need expert help. And that is the defining feature of that particular stage of burnout. And the other thing to bear in mind about that stage is that burnout is not considered to be a mental health problem. But if people do experience a mental health problem, then that stage of burnout is the stage where most people experience it. And the most commonly reported mental health problem in that stage is depression. So if you are in that stage, then you're likely to also be feeling incredibly low, unmotivated. You might be self-neglecting. I'm talking about fundamental things like not taking your medications, not eating properly, not exercising, all of that sort of, all of the basic stuff that you have to do to look after yourself.
Thank you. We've got some quick fire questions that I ask all my guests that come on. So the name of the podcast is What's the Chari-tea? I just like to know, are you a tea person or a coffee person generally?
I'm actually both. So I'm a creature of habit. I always start my day with a cup of Builder's tea. It has to be Twinings everyday tea and it's got to be strong. And then I always have a flat white in the middle of the morning. And then I drink decaf for the rest of the day. So I'm going to firmly stick down the middle and say I drink both and I love both.
Good. What's the one thing that you learned from your experience of burnout, if you could, one key takeaway?
I would say the key takeaway is that it's not forever. And I think it's really important to remember that when you're in the thick of it, because when you're in the thick of it, it feels so overwhelming and awful and isolating to experience. It's very difficult to see the light at the end of the tunnel. It feels like you're never going to get better, and you're likely to be experiencing despair, disillusionment, despondency over it. And I know certainly I did. But there is hope, and you will get better. You will get back to where you were. It just takes time. But I think knowing that there is an endpoint to it is really helpful, and having hope is really crucial.
Okay, is there anybody in the non-profit world that you'd like to give a shout out to?
So I do quite a lot of work with Doctors in Distress, which is a charity that was set up to reduce the suicide rate in doctors, because doctors are 3 to 5 times more likely compared to the general population to die by suicide. And very interesting, actually, the risk is higher in female doctors compared to male doctors, which again is different to the general population. And so this is a charity that is founded by Amandeep Sindhu, whose brother was an anaesthetist and sadly died by suicide. And it's currently headed up by Mary Jane Roberts, and I lead their burnout recovery course. And I do quite a lot of work with them. So it's a charity that's very close to my heart.
Oh, that's brilliant. What's your go-to comfort ritual after a busy day?
So I love to be creative. So my hobby is sewing, and I like to plan my creative projects. I like to engage in sewing as well, because it allows me to get into the flow state, which is really helpful for burnout and stress management as well. So if I've got time, because unfortunately my sewing space is also our kitchen table, so it's where the kids eat, it's where they do their homework, it's where everything gets dumped. So it's not always something that is accessible to me, but I do love to do that. Failing that, I go for a walk every day. I need a bit of sunlight. Not this time of year, but I do need that, and I need a bit of fresh air, and that again just allows me to get that flow state.
Yeah, definitely. And if you could give one piece of advice to someone in the non-profit sector that's listening, and they want to improve their well-being, what would you tell them?
I would start with monitoring your stress levels, because if you don't know where you're at with your burnout risk and your stress levels, then you can't progress to the next bit, which is actively changing and making those changes and reducing your burnout risk, or taking that first step on that burnout recovery process. So I would say, the first thing is to start to, actively monitor your stress levels. That would be where I would begin.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a really, really interesting and helpful conversation, I think, for a lot of people. How can listeners follow you, connect with you?
Yep, so I'm on social media. My handle is at Dr. Claire Ashley. And people can also buy my book, The Burnout Doctor, available from Amazon and all good bookstores now.
Fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. That's it for today's episode. If anything we talked about today has brought up feelings that you're struggling with, it's really important that you reach out for support. So please do speak with your GP and also seek support from organisations like Mind, who offer resources and guidance that many people find reassuring during difficult times. Thank you so much again for joining me with this episode. If you'd like to keep the conversation going, you can connect with me on social media or drop me a message. I'd love to hear your thoughts or questions or ideas for future episodes. All the links are in the show notes, so please do come and say hello. And if you can spare 2 minutes, please do leave us a review. It really helps us to spread the word about What's the Charity and keep the conversation going. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one.